Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris. Before we begin today, please remember to keep President Trump and the First Lady in your prayers for a speedy and full recovery. Now, we're less than a month out, but not just a month out from Election Day. We are less than a month out from what may very well be shaping up to be the end of this era. As many of you know who've been following Church Militant for a while now, we have been very concerned, and saying so, about the gathering evil clouds. We were concerned in 2016 and said so, as it appeared Hillary would win. Imagine where we'd be right now if that had happened. But right now, it appears increasingly likely that, at least in the natural order, that Biden will win. Understand that the forces that were behind Hillary are the same forces behind Biden. The only difference is that now they are enraged that they weren't able to execute their wickedness 4 years earlier. By their timetable, they are 4 years behind. By now, they should have been able to usher in a socialist new world order, and they could have done it somewhat quietly, little by little, no one really kind of paying that much attention. But the surprise election of Donald Trump, looking more and more like it was ordained by heaven, threw the demonic off course. Depending on which side you are on, his election victory was either a reprieve or a delay. But here we are now, at this moment, uncertain as we peer into the future. Increasingly, important voices in the church are raising the alarm, a clarion call about what a Trump defeat would entail for not just the country but the world. Quote, "The outcome of the U.S. election will determine whether the U.S. remains the leading power in the world for freedom and democracy, or whether a communist dictatorship will assume that role for the global community." Closed quote. Those words are spoken by the highly influential Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, former prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, until he ran afoul of Francis's Vatican. He went on to add, quote, "The free world owes the American people the salvation of Western civilization, which has its foundation in the freedom and dignity of every person. But his legacy is now being challenged." That's the world that Mueller foresees if Trump loses. The end of Western civilization, formed by the Catholic Church, by the way. But what arises in its place? That's the second voice we'd like to speak to. Quote, "We would be faced with an Orwellian dictatorship of the deep state and the deep church, in which the rights we today consider fundamental and inalienable would be trampled. The mainstream media will be complicit." That assessment from Archbishop Vigano a couple days ago. In fact, it's even more than that. He references St. Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, speaking of the forces of evil which would precede the appearance of the Antichrist. Those forces of evil, of the permitting of evil, greater evil than we see now, are currently being restrained, held back by heaven. But a Biden victory would signal that hell has been unleashed, according to Vigano. He says Biden is, quote, "a puppet manipulated by the elite, a puppet in the hands of people thirsty for power and willing to do anything to expand it," closed quote. He also laments the hierarchy's participation in all of this. The universal religion advocated by the United Nations and by Freemasonry finds active collaborators in the leaders of the Catholic Church who usurp its authority and adulterate its magisterium. All of this is on its way to becoming a preparation for Antichrist. Whether that will be sooner than later, nobody knows. But the world is on the verge, barely teetering on a freefall into near total darkness. Consider that part of all this has been accomplished by the Marxist-minded, politically woke atmosphere now gripping every corporate boardroom in America. Late last week, the former CEO of Twitter, Dick Costolo, tweeted, quote, "Me first capitalists who think you can separate society from business are going to be the first people lined up against the wall and shot in the revolution. I'll happily provide video commentary." Costello was responding to another CEO who said he was going to decouple political activism in his workplace from regular business for those employees who are sick and tired of the cancel culture. See, once this Pandora's box is opened, there is no closing it. The entire country has been prepped ahead of time, politically, culturally, commercially, for a woke culture that will give no allowance for religious beliefs or even personal conscience. As Vigano points out, like Church Militant has been shouting for years now, the media has led the way in this. To provide some measure of counter to their evil is why we started St. Michael's Media. As we peer into the future, these apocalyptic happenings will either occur relatively soon or they will be forestalled. They will happen. The question is when? Next year? 10 years from now? 100 years from now? But as we ponder that thought, the question arises, can you imagine a world where more would need to be done to receive who St. Paul calls the man of lawlessness? Millions and millions of children murdered in the womb every year. Sodomy celebrated as a right and even forced on children in schools. A church whose leadership has all but abandoned the faith, the supernatural faith across the world. If there was a time that earth would be ready to begin its final birth pains, it appears this might be that time. Yes, there is much more to this election than meets the eye. Much more. Make sure you are in a state of grace and praying every day. If hell is about to be unleashed, unchained from the depths, very few will survive. Only the souls committed deeply to our Lord and His Blessed Mother. God love you. I'm Michael Voris.